topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the host and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
What's working on purpose anyway? Each week, we ponder the answer to this question. People ache for meaning and purpose at work, to contribute their talents passionately and know their lives really matter. They crave being part of an organization that inspires them and helps them grow into realizing their highest potential. Business can be such a force for good in the world, elevating humanity. In our program, we provide guidance and inspiration to help usher in this world we all want, working on purpose. Now, here's your host, Dr. Alise Cortez.
Welcome back to the Working on Purpose program. Great to have you. Thanks for tuning in this week. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez, joining you live from Dallas, Texas, home base for me. If you've not met me yet and don't know my work, I'm a management consultant and organizational logotherapist specializing in activating meaning and purpose. My team and I help companies to detect and articulate their purpose to thread it through culture and operations. We work with forward-reaching organizations to develop inspirational leaders who create cultures where people actually want to come to work and do their best. And we provide programs that enable individual team members and leaders to discover and unleash their passion and purpose at work to catalyze fulfillment, engagement, and productivity. You can learn more about us and how we can work together at alisecortez.com. Also, if you like the content of the show, you may be interested in my next book due out in March of 2023. It's called The Great Revitalization, How Activating Meaning and Purpose Can Radically Enliven Your Business. You can pre-order your copy at bookshop.org or barnesandnoble.com. Now let's get into today's program. With us is the author of Collaborative Advantage, which we talked about together on air in 2019. Paul Skinner is also the founder of the Agency of the Future, which helps clients create collaborative advantage and other things to drive organizational success. He's also the founder of the Social Enterprise Marketing Kind, which brings together marketers and good causes to create transformational pro bono projects for social good. The guy's slightly busy, kind of an amazing man. Today, we'll be talking about his fabulous new book, The Purpose Upgrade. Change your business to save the world. Change the world to save your business. Paul Skinner, welcome back to Working on Purpose.
Thank you, Alise. How are you?
I'm great. I'm with you, Paul. I mean, you are such a brilliant mind. You know, I know that embarrasses you when I say that to you, but I just really love how your mind works. And I'm really happy to get to share you once again with my listeners and viewers, because this next book you've written, Paul, it's stunningly brilliant. Kind of like you.
Well, I can't think of a better way to start the new year.
I can't either. And you know, it's what's so beautiful about it is you've really taken the notion of purpose, as I know you intended, to a whole other level. And I want to be sure and showcase that in our conversation today. But before we get into this, I also want to celebrate and applaud you for letting us in on the journey of being an author, Paul. You posted a video on LinkedIn when you got your first shipment of your brand new books from the publisher. And it was delightful to get to be with you in your home as you opened the box and you were cutting the box open, and you said, wouldn't it be funny if somebody else's book showed up? Not really. Not really.
Well, it was a special moment because I don't know about you, but I appreciate books as physical objects.
Me too.
I don't personally have much interest in ebooks unless it's a necessity. Mm-hmm. I love books as physical objects. I'm quite open to audiobooks because for me that's just such a different experience and you can enjoy it in a different way. But I love books as physical objects, and I actually think we could invest in even better presented books physically, because I've often believed that, really the cost of a book isn't the price that you pay, because that's relatively small, really. It's a couple of cups of coffee. The real cost of a book is the investment of time that you put into reading it. And so I actually quite like beautifully presented books. I love the way they smell, the way they open and sit in the hand. And so that is a very special moment. And I'm sure you felt the same way with Purpose Ignited.
I did. I really did. So I'm going to take a note because I have 2 new books coming out. So at some point I'll do something similar. So I'm giving a nod to you as appropriate. So, okay, well, let's get into this book. There's so much to cover here. And I want to start with the promise of your book, Paul. And as we talk here, listeners and viewers, I like to read some passages from the book because it's just so beautifully written. And then I'll get you, Paul, to weigh in on it. But you start by, when we talk about this, the idea of a purpose upgrade. I really love the idea of opening our conversation with this opportunity. You say there's compelling evidence now that shows how that playing the part in tackling society's most pressing priorities, enterprises can create more attractive benefits for customers, build more meaningful livelihoods for colleagues, and unlock superior returns for investors, thereby bringing all the stakeholders that a business needs into alignment around a greater ambition. That sounds really good to me, Paul.
Yeah. Well, since Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, we've been encouraged to believe that if we seek selfish benefit first, then we're meant to end up with a collective good as the happy byproduct. Right. I recently heard somebody say that perhaps the invisible hand was invisible because it's not really there. But it's certainly the case that we have systemic challenges today that show that model is broken down. But the good news is that both reason and evidence suggests that if you flip that on its head and you start by seeking to contribute first, then you do end up being able to derive your own self-directed reward as your share of what I describe in the book as the far greater overall wealth of change that making an enterprise a channel for something greater than itself can unlock.
Yeah, and I really also appreciate that you distinguish that, fulfilling true human needs rather than manufacturing spurious consumerist wants has become the biggest business opportunity of our time. I really align with that, Paul. That really aligns with, it's also what I have in many ways in my new book, The Great Revitalization. I told you that we have some wonderful alignment and sing-song and complementarity in our works there. So then you go on to say, which is so beautiful, I love this, you say purpose is awakened by problems to solve.
Yeah.
And I just think that's really helpful to understand for people to recognize, and that what you're encouraging us to do, Paul, is to gaze higher for a bigger, more complex problem to go after. That's what you're saying in your book. And I just think that's so compelling.
Yeah, I came across a book recently by Henry Kissinger, where he puts in a single word the leadership strategies of different world leaders that he worked with. And so your comment reminds me of that, because I would say if we were to put the purpose upgrade in a single word in terms of what kind of strategy it is, then I'd say it's a strategy of elevation. It's a strategy of how can we be more useful to each of our stakeholder groups. I might pick up on your comment on needs. I remember researching for the book, I came across an article, I think it was in 1927, by Paul M. Mazur in the Harvard Business Review, saying that businesses needed to go from meeting needs to meeting wants. And I think in some ways, my background profession, marketing, you could say was born in that moment, the process of creating, stimulating desires, and fostering, as you say, a sort of consumerism. I think that today, in a sense, the pendulum needs to switch back, and we need to get better at understanding fundamental human needs, because we are in an ever more crisis-prone world. The word of the year this year was permacrisis. And so I think we need to get much better at now leaning back into actually what does the world really need, and rooting our long-term value creation processes in that need. So I think, as you say, we need to find the most valuable problems that we can to solve, whether or not that happens to be aligned with our prior assumptions. And for marketing, to finish that part of the thought, I think that we need to get much better at moving, perhaps the purpose upgrade for us as marketers is to go from making the attractive necessary, as Paul M. Mazur advised us to do, and to advance to making the necessary attractive. How are we going to upgrade our lives and patterns of work to make them truly compatible with an environment that has become crisis prone and to which we need to respond?
Mm-hmm. All the more reason why you talk about some myth busting, which I think we'll talk about a little bit later in the show if I have that right in my notes here. But one of the things that you also say, which is really going to probably upset, and I don't mean in a bad way, some of our listeners and viewers, is that if we don't think about purpose as fixed, like a North Star. A lot of people, as you know and talk about in your book, do reference and consider purpose like their North Star. And you talk about how that becomes quite singular and is really quite insufficient.
Yeah, so first of all, I want to concede that people have done good things with that analogy. You know, North
Absolutely.
Star gives you a direction of travel, and pursuing purpose is a direction of travel. But it is a singular fixed object. And of course, in a human world, our problems keep changing. I think this sort of borrows from the biggest story that we have in the West, or the biggest archetype of story, which is the redemption narrative. So the idea is, you know, problem is A. If only we provide solution B, then C, we get to live happily ever after. And so that's where we get this notion of things like the North Star, which, you know, perhaps borrow from the notion of the Star of Bethlehem. And what's interesting is, you know, have happened to have worked with a lot of leaders in the field of disasters and emergencies, for example. Mm-hmm. And what you learn is that communities can often be, you know, when they're hit by a disaster or an emergency, can often be at their most purposeful. And certainly that context of a disaster or emergency gives them reason to be purposeful. Mm. And of course, that involves completely reprioritizing, and couldn't be further removed from the sort of straightforward linear planning that you might associate with purpose as a singular fixed end point. I mean, I think this year, of course, we've had serious conflict in Europe since February. And I'm reminded of President Zelensky's comment from earlier in the year that Ukraine didn't seek greatness, but Ukraine has become great. And I think that we need to remind ourselves that purpose is, for humans, our potentially most adaptive capacity. That for organizations, it can be a renewable resource. And that a purpose upgrade is an always available event, because we're never working perfectly on purpose, and we're never completely immune from fresh demands from our operating environment. So a purpose upgrade can be an always available event.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that you say in your book that just really smacked me, and as you know, Paul, I read these books cover to cover, and I have pages of typewritten notes from the book. One of the things that I think is really important for us to convey to our listeners and viewers is what you're talking about there is really paying attention to and utilizing situational intelligence. And what I like about that, there are so many things I like about that. One of the things that you say, Paul, in your book is you say, you know, people get this idea that if they just look inward, they'll be able to figure out their purpose. If they just stew enough inward, they'll figure it out as an individual or as a company. And you miss all of that situational intelligence that's available to you to be able to catalyze what's the big problem that I can actually work on solving here. What are my stakeholders suggesting that we might want to work on together for a bigger ambition? So I love how you contextualize everything, Paul, because it makes everything so much more dynamic.
Yeah, and we're often told purpose is about authenticity. And again, like the North Star analogy, there is some merit in it, in that it's very hard for a business, for example, to claim a purpose that is fundamentally at odds with who the business is run by and what it stands for. But you know, purpose doesn't best come from introspection alone. There'd be no point in offering, for example, an experience of authentic gastronomic delight in an environment of food poverty. Right. So really, purpose is born as a product of the interaction between ourselves and others in the context in which we find ourselves. Mm-hmm. And that's true for us as individual humans, it's true for us as communities, and it's true for us in organizational life as well.
Mm-hmm. You talk about that in the book as well. It's such a great example to really situate why the situational piece is so important. Okay, now let's take it another level here. So for a lot of people, and this was what you did in your book that's so beautiful, is you honor everything that came before us, and then you say, and wait, there's more. And so one of the things that you do beautifully, I think, is this is from your chapter 2 in the purpose upgrade, and there are concepts that you're reaching beyond that people already recognize through purpose upgrade, and they are CSR, corporate societal, I forget what that stands for, ESG, stakeholder capitalism, brand purpose even, and social enterprise. And I think this is really important for us to talk about, because those are all great things, and they've really helped pull us along toward a higher consciousness in the way that we do our business. And yet there's still more.
Yeah, so there is value in all of these things, and also limitation. So take CSR, I think corporate social responsibility, the first on your list. That can make a very sincere contribution, but it's the part of a business that is giving back. It's not it doesn't define the business model. It doesn't define what kind of change a particular business is bringing to the world. And so it's a pleasant sideshow, and maybe a valuable one, but a sideshow. ESG, again, sustainability governance is incredibly important, but just being sustainable doesn't mean you're solving important problems, and you get anomalies with ESG, such as the fact that I think in last year, according to Refinitiv data, for example, they ranked British American Tobacco as the third best performing ESG company in the world. Wow. Stakeholder capitalism, again, very important. I think it's a bit like work-life balance. So work-life balance can be good for your life, it can be good for work, but it doesn't necessarily change what you're doing when you're in the office or working from home, whatever it may be. So getting a better balance between stakeholders is useful, but it doesn't necessarily mean there's a generative purpose at the heart of a business to begin with. Brand purpose, again, a lot of brands are very innovative in their work on social purpose, for example, but if a brand purpose is not aligned with corporate purpose, or is even, in a worst case scenario, at odds with it in some way, maybe the business is avoiding paying taxes that could be used to solve some of the problems they're campaigning on, for example, then you have a challenge. So I think it's incredibly important to understand the value of these ideas, but business leaders need to know what kind of business to lead, what kind of problems to solve, what kind of solutions to bring, what kind of change they want to bring to the world. And that is a more fundamental question than any of those concepts alone tend to address.
Beautifully articulated. Thank you, Paul. On that note, let's let our listeners and viewers chew on what you just said there and take our first break. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. We've been on the air with Paul Skinner, who is the author of The Purpose Upgrade. We've been talking a bit about some of the promise of the book and why it's a good thing to start to pay attention to and work toward. After the break, we're going to get into some of the key aspects of what is an actual purpose upgrade and how to go about it. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Dr. Alise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Alise to speak to your organization, please visit her at alisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Alise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Alise, send an email to Alise, A-L-I-S-E, at alisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Welcome back to Working on Purpose. Thanks for staying with us and tuning in today. If you haven't checked out my first book, Paul mentioned it earlier, it's Purpose Ignited. I hope you'll check that out. I really wrote that book to awaken readers to their passion and their purpose and start them down the path of becoming an inspirational leader who can actually start to steward this work that we're talking about today on the show. If you're just joining the program today, my guest is Paul Skinner. He's the founder of the Agency of the Future, which helps clients create collaborative advantage to drive organizational success. And he's also the founder of the social enterprise marketing kind, which brings together marketers and good causes to create transformational pro bono projects for social good. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. So next, Paul, what I'd love to do here, we've been talking conceptually here, and that's beautiful. I love these ideas. I want to also now talk about some application. So you mentioned this chap named Mick in your book here. And I think it would be interesting if you could introduce Mick to our listeners and viewers and talk a little bit about his transformational purpose journey.
Yeah, of course. So Mick Jackson, he's a very interesting character, Dr. Mick Jackson. He's a former, quite well-known musician, as it happens, very creative individual and very entrepreneurial. He was actually on a mountaineering expedition. So he had a very clear goal to achieve, which was to climb K2. Actually, the twin peaks, K2 and Broad Peak. And then actually, tragically, a young French boy was found dead in a tent ahead of them due to exposure to the conditions. And of course, his body was airlifted from the mountain. But then a few hours later, the Kashmiri tribesman who was guiding Mick's expedition also became very seriously ill. It so happened that the expedition behind them included the Bulgarian Minister for Health, who was still a practicing physician, but who identified that at that altitude, the Kashmiri tribesmen, could just have a few hours to live, and the authorities refused to send a helicopter. And so Mick, the Kashmiri tribesman was actually prepared to move on. But Mick didn't want to accept that. His expedition didn't want to accept that. So they undertook a fairly arduous, very arduous 4-day descent where they literally carried the tribesman down the mountain. And it did save his life. But it also changed Mick's life because he just came to the reflection that, in some sense, brutally, the thought occurred to him, is a dead Westerner valued more than a living tribesman? And so he decided as a businessman to completely repurpose his enterprise activities to change the relationship between business and people and to fight poverty by succeeding in business. And I think one of the things that we can really learn from Mick actually is that one of the great advantages of running a purposeful organization is that it is a much more interesting story for people to engage with. So Mick deliberately went into business activities that you could call boring before he got there. He did things like stationery provision for office supplies. And he said, I remember Mick telling me this is not the kind of business that usually ends up in Fast Company magazine or the Harvard Business Review. But he associated those businesses with driving microfinance initiatives, which, during the time I wrote the book, I think he's now transformed the lives of more than 2 million people affected by poverty with microfinance from the proceeds from Wild Heart's office, his office supplies business. And so as he puts it to his team and to anyone he talks to, really, even a bad day at the office can save lives. And when you put a story like that at the heart of your business, you not only have a positive impact, but it's so much easier to engage people with that impact. I mean, I'm pretty sure that nobody's ever heard a pitch for office supplies that equals the charisma, enthusiasm, and real merit of the pitches that Mick and his team can put before people.
I would agree. And I have to read just a little passage from your book relative to this, because I think it takes it one step further. You say, and I quote, "Without taking any money from governments or soliciting donations, the drive to upgrade the purpose of enterprise has made it possible for Mick to reimagine entrepreneurial endeavor as a vocation and restore the intrinsic dignity of work." It's beautiful, and then that takes me to the next thing that I came to, and I have to say I read this chapter a couple of times It was the one where you're talking about, the 6 kinds of story, et cetera. And that speaks to what you said about, being able to describe the enterprise like this and what we're doing and why it's important, which becomes so sticky and so compelling. That's where I really came to understand, Paul, how your beautiful background in marketing really makes a difference in how it is that you help others get access to purpose and talk about it and describe it to bring it into life. So I don't know if you want to talk about all of the different kinds of story, that because there were 6, but it was so compelling for me to see how you really broke them down. And I recognize that when I do identity and purpose work individually with companies, I'm using some of those components as well. I just didn't realize that they were called those things. So thank you, Paul.
Well, stories are incredibly important to us. I mean, really, it's the ability to tell ourselves stories of purpose that help us go beyond immediate circumstances in pursuit of more abstract goals that you could argue is our unique, sort of defining advantage as a species, or our most adaptive capacity as humans. And it's certainly the reason why, for example, unlike other species, we haven't just evolved, but have also been able to develop from generation to generation. And so those stories are incredibly important. When we talk about the value of stories in business, we are often, I think, referring to the stories told by a business to its customers. And that, of course, is incredibly important and valuable. But if we think about all of the stories all of our stakeholders are telling themselves and each other, that is far less singular, and it adds up to something far more important than the stories that we are simply telling them. I mean, nothing has a greater influence over us than stories. Behavioral science shows that in practice, we're more drawn to a good life story than a good life, because a good life story is a coping mechanism that we use to tackle our problems and better engage with each other. So it confers real evolutionary advantage. Robert J. Schiller, the American economist, showed that, decade after decade, the biggest driver of economic events is the stories that we tell ourselves across society. And so you're right, in that chapter, I recognize the value of the story that a business tells to its stakeholders, but I also look at the other narratives. So, story listening. How can we step out of our organizational roles, take our organizational hats off, and just listen to people as they see themselves, as they see each other, and what can we learn about real fundamental human need? Story tuning, for example. How do you line up the stories that different stakeholder groups may be saying that otherwise might be at odds with each other? I remember a cancer charity, for example, had the trouble that they wanted to tell their donors that cancer is just the worst possible thing that you could imagine, but they couldn't, because what happens if some of the people that they're supporting come across that communication? Because you don't want to tell somebody affected with cancer, what you want to tell them is that it is a tractable situation, that there are things you can do about it. And so eventually they squared that circle by suggesting that cancer is something no one should face alone. There's story editing. How can you help people tell a better story about themselves? One example from the book is, of course, McKinsey, the consulting organization, where at McKinsey, if you're not going to get a certain promotion, then there comes a point when you end up, it's best for both parties for you to leave the firm. In many contexts, that would lead to a little bit of disappointment or animosity, perhaps. But McKinsey rebrands that as becoming an alumnus of the McKinsey network. And of course, that positive relationship and seeing that ongoing connection to McKinsey turns a lot of its ex-employees into valuable future clients for the good, hopefully, of both parties. Story doing is very important. If you're going to make a promise to your stakeholders of some kind of better that you're going to help them step into, then you also, of course, have to live up to that. I remember fascinating conversation with the marketer Seth Godin, telling me that if you do enough mission action, then the mission statement writes itself. And so we have to remember that, our stories are something that we have to live up to. And I think all of these techniques are only going to become more important in the environment we're moving towards, because I think, really, as we move beyond consumerism as the next big thing and actually addressing fundamental needs, I think that business excitement in the future, the epitome of understanding narrative in business, is not going to be the Super Bowl ad. It's going to be the B2B venture that is helping a disparate variety of stakeholders collectively achieve a valuable, sustainable long-term mission, for example. And so I think a very different type of appreciation of narrative is going to be necessary for that.
Right. And this is where we build and we stand on the back of collaborative advantage, right? I mean, I love how your work continues to evolve and grow bigger and shine. And you do, all this is mentioned in the book. I love the McKinsey example as well, by the way. I want to also talk a little bit about Monique of the Green Girls in America. I love how you say we need fewer fixed solutions bolted awkwardly onto dynamic problems. We need more people like Monique who can adapt around the needs of emerging problems and foster solutions that work across ecosystems and through communities as a whole, empowering greater outcomes from within them and from without. I just think that is so compelling. It goes back to what we've been saying so far, Paul. Everything about the narrative piece that you were talking about, to me, I map that over into, if you might remember in Purpose Ignited, I talk about becoming a compelling storyteller, learn how to tell stories because it's inspiring. So tell us a little bit about Monique and what she's doing, if you would.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I'll preface it by saying there's such a thing as an outsight. So if people have heard of insights in business, an outsight is a mistaken belief held by one group of people about what's actually important to another group. And I think a lot of businesses fundamentally misunderstand what's important to their customers, particularly when they just view them as consumers of their products. And the same in the world of development, for example. Now, Monique is very interesting in this regard because she has dedicated her life to helping people in many ways like herself. So she understands their context and can see through their eyes. She was born, her parents were from different tribes in Cameroon, which was something of a taboo, which meant that they weren't invited to family gatherings and things like that. And then when she was 12, sadly, her father died, and his family not only disowned them, but forcibly seized their possessions and left them destitute. So she went from being in a fairly well-to-do family, relatively affluent lifestyle, to being homeless and facing extreme poverty overnight, and diminished access even to basics, potable water, and so on. And at 12 years old, she decided that she was going to dedicate her life to making sure that she would protect other girls and women from having to go through the same thing. At 22, she became a human rights lawyer, but she maintained that understanding of context. So she ended up having a number of roles for leading NGOs, for example, who had sort of ideas as to how they could help women and girls in different states across Africa. And often her purpose upgrades came in the form of her realizing that actually there was another problem underneath the problem she was there to solve, and that solving the problem underneath was going to lead to a much more powerful long-term solution than just solving the problem that had already been identified.
I'm just going to comment briefly on that because I didn't want to grab our last break here. But what I really appreciate about what you're teaching us, what you're inviting us to do, Paul, is to become better thinkers, also to become better observationists, to become better at recognizing what's going on around us and seeing how we can actually help. And I just really think that is it just so speaks to my heart and soul. I'm so glad to have you on, Paul. Thanks for writing yet another fantastic book. Let's grab our next break. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. We're on the air with Paul Skinner, who is the author of The Purpose Upgrade. We've been talking a bit about a few examples of people who have upgraded their purpose as we go along here. After the break, we're going to hear about DSM's remarkable purpose upgrade. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Dr. Alise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Alise to speak to your organization, please visit her at alisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Alise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Alise, send an email to Alise, A-L-I-S-E, at alisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us and welcome back to Working on Purpose. One other bit of news I want to share with you is the anthology that I curated called Passionately Striving in Why is available, and it showcases 25 stories from women around the world who share their very intimate story of how they discovered their purpose and are now serving from it. One of those stories is also from Cameroon, by the way, Paul. We have stories from Australia to Zambia, so I hope you'll check that out as well. If you're just joining the program today, my guest is Paul Skinner. He is the founder of the Agency of the Future, which helps clients create collaborative advantage to drive organizational success. He's also the founder of the social enterprise Marketing Kind, which brings together marketers and good causes to create a transformational pro bono projects for social good. I'm your host, Dr. Alise Cortez. So for this last bit here, I really wanted to showcase an organization that you and I both know and really admire. And we were both introduced to it through Hugh Welsh, who's been on this program a couple of times. And I'm a big fan of Hugh Welsh, you know that. So if we can, let's just start with, this notion of, I think it's a 106-year-old company. It was started as the Dutch state mines. And it's gone through quite a journey toward a purpose upgrade over time. Can we start with how they now refer themselves today from Dutch state mines? What do they call themselves now?
So it's still a Royal DSM, and they are about to merge with Firmenich. But DSM now stands, at least informally, for do something meaningful. Mm-hmm. And I'd say that what appeals to me, so in a sense, we can think, just to scoot back up contextually one level, we can think about a purpose upgrade as being taking on an additional purpose to our central purpose. For example, a lot of businesses integrating sustainable development goals into their business. In the case of an entrepreneur like Mick, they might exit some activities and launch new activities through their purpose upgrade. A lot of businesses that are functioning today, however, the right thing isn't just to exit those businesses, because they're already doing good things, they're already employing people, they're already creating positive societal benefits. But we are going to need to either reposition activities within them or the fundamental core. And this does have to reach all of us, because today the problem is just so vast. I mean, there's the percentage of businesses that know that they are unambiguously a net contributor to the world rather than a net deductor when you factor in all of their social and environmental impacts is frighteningly small. So what I love about DSM is, you could say purpose upgrades, great for agile digital businesses, great for startups, great for social enterprises. But what about if you're operating in heavy industry? So of course, DSM was literally born as a coal mining business. Now, what's also interesting about that, it was born from digging coal out of the ground and delivering it to people's homes for heating and illumination. What's interesting about that is, at the time, that was a really respectable endeavor. People needed that heat, people needed that illumination. Of course, the mines are now closed. The business became a petrochemical company, and then it morphed into an industrial chemical company, which used a very similar skill set. But a pioneering CEO called Feike Siebesma, who I was able to work with on the book, as well as the current leadership team, which comprises 2 co-CEOs, said to his board, actually, I'm not sure that the world really needs us to continue producing industrial chemicals. There are reasons for investors to object to the tight margins and volatility. more important than that, I don't see us as really serving a long-term societal need. So at DSM, they really study the world's greatest needs and then build a business to address those needs. I remember Feike saying to me that as a biologist, he knew that it wasn't necessarily the biggest or the strongest who survive, but the most adaptive. And so he was able to take DSM on a transformational journey from industries that may have been perfectly respectable, but were not well aligned with what the world now needs, into a business which focuses on sustainable food, the circular economy, and really addressing important needs. And actually, I've got a note of some of the goals that they're working on at the moment, if that makes sense to share. So
it'd be great.
Of how a business is a channel for something greater than itself. They have 5 food system pledges by 2030 that include closing the micronutrient gap for 800 million people, supporting the immunity of 500 million people, supporting the livelihoods of 500 million smallholder farmers, enabling double-digit farm emissions reductions, and reaching 150 million people with nutritious plant-based foods. So they're really looking at how you fix the world's broken food system. And that is a valuable aspiration for a business and its stakeholders.
It sure is. It really inspires me. In fact, when I first had Hugh Welsh on the show, Paul, I think it was 2018. I can't remember exactly, but I remember distinctly I put a social media post out and I put the link to the show on there. And a couple of people wrote and commented. One in particular said, "Can you introduce me to Hugh Welsh? I have been wanting to work for that company for years." And it speaks to the magnetism that happens when we really, really work from a purpose and are serving for something bigger than the world. Really quick here, and this really is a nice contrast. People sometimes don't really understand what we mean by purpose, and you've been helping us understand that it really is about solving problems. I was on a stage a year ago speaking to a conference, and the fellow speaker next to me literally belted out to the audience, "My purpose is to double my income." And I wanted to muzzle her and throw her off the stage just as soon as I finished, maybe vomiting. And I was like, I wanted to tell her audience, no, that's not right. That's not purpose. So I really appreciate how you're really showcasing that, purpose is about helping other people, solving others' problems.
Yeah, I want to give one example in response to that, actually, because a lot of business leaders will say, I run a £100 million business or a £500 million business or something. And probably that's not even very interesting to that many people in their own business, only them and a few colleagues probably. One interesting example, even staying within the realm of financial value creation, there's a fantastic social enterprise called the Eden Project, and that is a sustainable tourist attraction in Cornwall. They're actually replicating it across all of the continents now, actually. But one of the things that they've done since the start is to track the value of the tourism that they bring to Cornwall, which since it opened has already surpassed £2.2 billion, which can't be far short of 4 million. Well, a bit short of 4, somewhere over, likely north of $3 billion, depending on today's exchange value. Now that is a real wealth of change, and that gives all of their partners and supporters a real reason to get involved.
Well, and what I also appreciate about this whole work that we do in purpose, and you and I have been in this path together since we've known each other these last 3 years. But the thing about running a purpose upgraded organization or a purpose, guided organization is then it starts to spill over to all the way that you relate to all the stakeholders. So one of the other things I wanted you to speak about is DSM's X Time program, where I understand, according to your book, is they allow their employees to spend up to 10% of their working time working on projects that may have little to do with their individual core functions, but give them an additional opportunity to make a difference aligned with DSM's greater purpose. So I think that's really, really compelling. And really quick before you answer that, Paul, remember that, I'm a logotherapist, and so I traffic in the world of meaning. And one of our meaning sources is our creative offerings, what we give of ourselves, which I call passion. So if DSM is helping their employees to cultivate things that are really important to them, things that might be, their passions, and it's not even necessarily related to their core function, it's certainly in alignment with what I've been professing other companies do as well. So if you would, tell us a bit about this X time and how does it work, and if you've got any examples of how it showed up.
And I think to relate it back to your starting comment about how we relate with all stakeholders with meaning and purpose, so we might expand it. But X time is 10% of staff time at DSM, where they can pursue initiatives that, as you say, are outside of their core function in terms of their discipline, but not outside of their core purpose, and that all of their activity is purposeful. And I think the origin for that came from an insight from Feike Siebersma. So he had some very powerful transformational experiences. Their partnerships with the World Food Programme came after he heard a leader of an African state saying, aid agencies and aid programs give people carbohydrate-rich food that keeps them alive, but not protein-rich food that keeps them productive. So it sort of keeps the problem going rather than solves it. So he initiated a partnership with the World Food Programme to address that with protein-rich foods. And when he was visiting Bangladesh to see some of that partnership in operation, he met a mother who showed Feike her infant. And then as he was holding the infant, she said, take it. And he didn't understand. He asked, what on earth do you mean? What? And she said, if you don't, what will happen. And he didn't. I don't think that she got to the end of that sentence, but that really changed him. This wasn't an intellectual pursuit anymore. It was something he had deep conviction for, and he also realized that experience had changed his life forever. But how do you run a business where everybody needs their own story? They need to change their own life forever, and they need to feel that conviction as a narrative about themselves in their own minds. And there are fewer better ways to do that than to give people opportunities to change the world for themselves, and people can derive their own narratives around that. Now, I would say this applies to all of our stakeholders. So in conventional economic thinking, we think of people as consumers, humans as resources, our home as an asset to be exploited, investors as shareholders, and so on. But actually, all of these stakeholder groups, we can see them in the round through the lens of meaning and purpose and be the better for it. People are not just consumers, they're actively trying to improve their own lives, and our role is just to support them and find some kind of better for them to step into. Humans are not just resources, but colleagues bring their discretionary effort and talent to bear on their work, and all the more so if they have conviction in that work. Investors are not just walking checkbooks, but are people who can commit to a future with us, and hold us up to that future if we can create the right shared vision with them. And of course, communities are not just markets, they're the things that make all of it worthwhile to begin with. And our shared home isn't just an asset to be exploited, but is our ultimate renewable resource as long as we work with nature rather than against it.
Beautiful, Paul. I wish we had more time, because I also wanted you at some point, we'll just dangle this out here, that you also talk about how DSM ties its compensation to such things like reducing greenhouse gases. Executives' compensation is connected to that. And that's really, really critical. Talk about moving behaviors and such. We don't have time to talk about that, but I want to dangle that for our listeners and viewers and get them to read that part of your book as well. So now that we have come to the end of the show, Paul, it's great to have you back. The show has evolved to being a thought leadership platform that advances that conversation to create those workplaces where people want to come to work, give their best. The inspirational leaders lead them to their greatness, and we do business that betters the world. What would you like to leave them with?
So I think that there is so much difficulty today. I referred to perma-crisis is the word of the year. And if we are realistic with the science around the climate emergency and biodiversity loss, I mean, the UN Secretary General has said code red for humanity, and humanity has become a weapon of mass extinction. If we look at the inequality statistics and see how many people are getting more and more precariously excluded from the benefits of capitalism, then if we're realistic, we see that there are really substantial problems to solve. As one of our guests at Marketing Kind put it to me, throughout most of our existence, there would have been nothing we could do to destroy our home. With the invention of nuclear weapons, there was something we could do to destroy quite a lot of it if we made a very serious set of mistakes. Whereas today, we're at a point where if we just continue with life and business as usual, it's guaranteed, it's baked in as an outcome now. So there is a lot of reason to be fearful. So if we're going to be realistic and we want to have hope, I think where the hope comes from is that our stories of purpose can be far more malleable than we usually realize. I remember Ian Goldin, who ran the state bank for President Mandela, telling me that, before Mandela was released from prison, nobody today would think that apartheid is a good idea in South Africa, but before Mandela was released from prison, a majority of white people did think it was a good idea. And so our stories can change incredibly quickly, and as he continued, 20% of people can change 80% of our stories. So we really do need to upgrade our narratives as to the kind of good life that we can support our stakeholders in achieving, the kind of change we want to bring to the world. And if we use the malleability of our narratives and scaffold them appropriately, I do think that we can get out of the problems that we face.
Compelling way to finish, Paul. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful. I'm grateful to have you as a friend to share with my listeners and viewers. Thank you for coming back on Working on Purpose.
Thank you for having me.
Listeners and viewers, if you want to learn more about Paul Skinner, the work he does, the books he's written, start by visiting his website. It's simply AOF.com, Agency of the Future. I will see you next week. And remember that work is an important and compelling part of our lives and a means for us to be able to realize our potential and make the impact that we crave. So let's work on purpose.
We hope you've enjoyed this week's program. Be sure to tune into Working on Purpose, featuring your host, Dr. Alise Cortez, each week on W4CY. Together, we'll create a world where business operates conscientiously, leadership inspires impassioned performance, and employees are fulfilled in work that provides the meaning and purpose they crave. See you there. Let's work on purpose.